The auctioneer's gavel came down on a Tuesday morning in March of 1987, and nobody bid. Not on the first tractor, not on the second, and certainly not on the rusted, seized, immovable hulk of a 1963 John Deere 402. Oh, that sat at the back of a government impound lot outside Abilene, Texas. Its engine locked solid, its tires flat to the rim, its serial number stamped into a frame that the county had declared legally unsellable to any licensed farm equipment dealer in the state. What would you do if everything you knew became worthless overnight? Most people would move on. Kenneth Walker doubled down. The auctioneer moved on. That was the job. But Kenneth Walker didn't move on. He stood at the edge of that lot in a worn flannel shirt that had been washed so many times the color had faded to suggestion, and he counted the tractors not for what they were, but for what they could become. There were 14 of them, 14 machines that the federal government had seized from bankrupt farms across West Texas between 1984 and 1987, during the worst agricultural collapse since the Dust Bowl. 14 tractors with fouled carburetors, locked axles, dead batteries, and paperwork problems that made every legitimate dealer walk away, shaking their heads. Kenneth Walker had $6,200 in a savings account. He spent $5,800 of it that morning. He bought all 14. The decision came from a place deeper than logic. 2 months earlier, December 1986, the John Deere dealership in Abilene had let him go. Cost-cutting, they called it. Computerized diagnostics were coming in, and management had decided the future of repair was in software, not in men who could rebuild a diesel injection pump by feel. Kenneth was 51 years old, unemployed, and had spent 36 years learning everything there was to know about machines that the industry had just decided were obsolete. What do you do when the world says your skills are worthless? He had started at 14, working in a shed outside Levelland, repairing cotton pickers for neighboring farms. His father put him to work the week school let out for summer, and Kenneth never stopped. He got his GED at 22, married Pamela at 24, and spent the next 2.5 decades turning wrenches for that dealership at $11.40 an hour. They considered him indispensable until the day they decided they could live without him. The machine sat in that impound lot, the way forgotten things sit everywhere, gathering dust and proving their worthlessness by the simple fact of their abandonment. When the tractor seized up, when the diesel congealed, when the hydraulic lines cracked, when the starters corroded to paste, the government just lowered the appraised value and waited for auction day. Legitimate dealers wouldn't touch them. The liability was too high. You couldn't sell a machine with a locked engine without disclosing it, and no licensed dealer wanted to take on a 1963 John Deere 4020 that had been sitting in a Texas impound lot for 3 years and promised the buyer it would run. But Kenneth Walker wasn't a licensed dealer. He was a mechanic. His neighbor, Donald Harris, watched the tractor come off the borrowed flatbed trailer on a Wednesday afternoon and said without any apparent cruelty that Kenneth had just bought scrap metal that couldn't pull a toy wagon uphill. Donald ran 900 acres of wheat and had strong opinions about most things. He crossed his arms and studied the machine with the expression of a man watching someone make an expensive mistake in slow motion. Kenneth looked at the tractor, then at Donald. "We'll see." That was all he said. Then he went inside the 1,200-square-foot metal building he was renting on the edge of his property for $180 a month and started taking the engine apart. To understand what Kenneth saw in that impound lot, you need to understand what had happened to American agriculture in the previous decade. Between 1981 and 1988, more than 300,000 American farms went under. The Federal Reserve had raised interest rates to 21% to fight inflation, and farmers who had borrowed heavily in the 1970s, encouraged by government policy by land prices that seemed to only go up by the promise of global grain demand that never quite materialized, suddenly found themselves paying interest on operating loans that exceeded what their crops could ever earn. In Texas alone, the farm credit system foreclosed on more than 14,000 properties between 1984 and 1987. Banks failed, implement dealers closed. The county roads that had once seen a steady stream of green and red machinery going field to field went quiet. And when the banks and the government seized those farms, they took everything: the land, the buildings, the grain, and the equipment. The equipment sat in lots government impound yards, mostly administered by county sheriffs or federal marshals who had no interest in maintaining $40,000 machines and no budget to repair them. When the tractors seized up, they just sat there. The auctioneers came through periodically trying to move inventory that nobody wanted at prices that kept falling. By March of 1987, you could buy a 3-year-old tractor for 30% of its book value if you were willing to take on the mechanical problems and the legal headaches that came with it. Kenneth was willing. What nobody at that auction knew was Kenneth had a connection to that specific tractor, a connection that made this more than just business. In 1985, 2 years before the auction, Kenneth had repaired that exact 4020 for a farmer named George White. George ran 420 acres of cotton outside Sweetwater, and the tractor had come in with a cooling system problem that turned out to be more complicated than expected. Kenneth spent 3 days on it, working after hours because the dealership was backed up and George needed the machine for harvest. They talked while Kenneth worked. George had inherited the farm from his father, who had inherited it from his father. 3 generations of whites working the same land, and now the bank was sending letters. When George's farm went into foreclosure 6 months later, Kenneth asked if he could buy the 4020. The bank said no. Only licensed dealers. George stood in the dealership parking lot the day they came to repossess his equipment, and he found Kenneth in the service bay. "If anyone can save her, it's you, Kenneth. She deserves better than a scrapyard." 18 months after that conversation, George White was found in his barn. Financial despair, the county report said. The clinical language of suicide documented in official records. 2 years later, Kenneth saw that same 4020 in the government auction catalog, and the decision to buy it wasn't purely economic. It was a promise to a man who wasn't there to see it kept. The tractor held more than mechanical problems. It held the accumulated weight of an entire economic collapse, the physical evidence of farms that had failed families, that had scattered promises that couldn't be kept. Kenneth understood that even if he never said it out loud. He loaded the 4020 onto the trailer and brought it to the metal building, and he didn't think about whether it made business sense. He thought about George White standing in that parking lot, and he thought about 36 years of knowledge that the world had declared obsolete, and he decided both deserved better. The rebuild took 4 months. Kenneth didn't start with a business plan. He didn't have a spreadsheet. What he had was a spiral bound notebook that his daughter had left behind when she went to college, and in it he wrote down every part number, every torque specification, every injection, pump clearance, every valve timing sequence for that machine, and the 13 others sitting in his lot. The 4020's engine was the worst of them all. The previous owner had run it without coolant for what the seized cylinder walls suggested was the better part of a summer. 2 pistons had welded themselves to the bore. The injection pump had been replaced with an aftermarket unit that was 3 specifications wrong for the engine displacement. The cab, such as it was, an open station frame with a cracked fiberglass hood, had been used as a bird roost long enough that the wiring harness was compromised in 11 separate places. Kenneth started with the engine block. He pulled it completely, a task that required jacking the entire front end of the tractor and rigging a chain hoist from the rafters of the metal building. The pistons came out in pieces. Where metal should have moved freely inside machined cylinders, everything had fused into a solid mass. He spent a week just disassembling what should have taken a day, using heat and penetrating oil and patience to separate components that had become one. The parts came from 3 junkyards scattered across West Texas. Kenneth drove to each one personally, walking through acres of cannibalized equipment, pulling serial numbers, checking casting marks. In Amarillo, he found a retired parts dealer who still had a warehouse full of 1960s John Deere inventory that nobody had wanted for a decade. The man was surprised anyone was asking. "Most of this stuff is headed for the smelter," he said, gesturing at rows of shelving stacked with components wrapped in deteriorating paper. Kenneth bought what he needed and drove home with a truck bed full of parts that smelled like old grease and forgotten decades. One critical cylinder sleeve couldn't be sourced anywhere. Kenneth machined it himself on a lathe he'd bought at a bankruptcy auction for $340. The precision required was measured in thousandths of an inch. Too loose, and the piston would slap too tight, and it would seize again. He worked under a single bulb hanging from the ceiling of the metal building, measuring and remeasuring, cutting and checking until the sleeve fit with the kind of tolerance that would have made a factory machinist nod in approval. The engine work alone consumed 6 weeks. Then came the hydraulics. The 4020's hydraulic system runs on a closed-center design different from the open-center systems on older Deere models. The pump that had been installed by whoever had worked on the tractor before George bought it was from a 3020, which operates at a different pressure range. Kenneth pulled the wrong pump and sourced a correct replacement from a dealer in San Angelo, who was surprised anyone was asking for that part in 1987. The rebuild of the cylinder on the loader arm happened in the driveway over a weekend with Pamela bringing him coffee and sandwiches, and not asking why he was doing this. The electrical system presented its own challenges. 11 compromised points in the wiring harness meant 11 potential failures, 11 places where current might arc, or ground might fail, or resistance might build until something caught fire. Kenneth replaced the entire harness not because it was the efficient solution, but because tracing 11 faults through deteriorated insulation in a machine he was going to put back to work seemed like borrowing trouble. He ran new wire from the battery to every component, soldering connections, wrapping them in heat shrink tubing, routing everything away from moving parts and heat sources. The tires went on last. 4 used agricultural tires from a salvage yard in Sweetwater, not new, but good enough. The tread was still there, the sidewalls intact, the cost a fraction of what new ones would have run. 4 months after the auction on a July morning when the Texas heat was already building toward triple digits, Kenneth Walker started the 1963 John Deere 4020 for the first time. It started on the third crank. The engine caught, and the exhaust stack coughed black smoke, and then the smoke cleared, and there was just the sound of a diesel engine doing exactly what it's designed to do, which is run. Kenneth let it idle for 45 minutes. He stood there in the metal building with the door open, watching the temperature gauge, watching the oil pressure gauge, listening for the knock that would tell him a bearing wasn't seated right or a clearance was off. There was no knock. The temperature held steady. The oil pressure stayed where it should. The machine that everyone had walked away from, the machine that the government had declared legally unsellable. The machine that had sat in an impound lot for 3 years accumulating rust and bird nests was running. He drove it out of the building and across his property and back again. The hydraulics responded. The burr steering worked. The transmission shifted through its gears without grinding. When he parked it back inside and shut it down, the engine ticked as it cooled, and Kenneth stood there looking at it for a long time. Then he went inside and called Donald Harris. The phone rang 4 times before Donald picked up. Kenneth didn't waste words. "You want to rent a tractor for spring planting?" Donald was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that means a person is trying to figure out if they heard correctly. "I already have my own equipment. Mine's $1,000 for the season, all maintenance included." Another pause. "What if it breaks down? I fix it. That's the deal." Donald didn't answer right away. In 1987, renting a running 1960s-era tractor for field work was not a standard arrangement. The rental market for agricultural equipment was thin. Most farmers either owned their machines outright or bought used through dealers who offered financing. The concept of renting from a neighbor, from a man who'd just been laid off from the dealership, from someone with no business license or commercial insurance, struck Donald as the kind of thing that sounded reasonable until it went wrong. He thought about it for 3 days. Kenneth didn't push. He had 13 more tractors to rebuild, and the 4020 had taught him that each one would present its own specific combination of problems. While Donald considered the offer, Kenneth started on a 1961 International 560 that had a cracked cylinder head and an electrical system that looked like someone had rewired it in the dark with their eyes closed. On the third day, Donald drove over. He parked his truck and walked around the 4020 twice, not saying anything. He checked the hydraulic cylinders on the loader, running them through their full extension and retraction. He pulled the dipstick and examined the oil. He looked at the tires, bent down to check the tread depth. He straightened up and looked at Kenneth. "I'll try it for 1 season." That handshake was worth more than the $1,000. It was validation. That skill still mattered when the world said it didn't. March 1988. Kenneth Walker had just rented his first tractor. The deal was simple to the point of being nearly invisible as a business model. Donald would use the machine for spring planting and pay a flat fee that covered the entire season. If anything broke, Kenneth would fix it. No additional charges, no hourly rates for service calls, no parts markup. The machine came with Kenneth's phone number and the understanding that he would be available when needed. Donald took the 4020 to his fields and put it to work. Kenneth waited. The first call came 2 weeks later, mid-morning, on a Thursday. Donald's voice on the phone was careful, almost apologetic. Got a situation out here. Hydraulic line on the loader is weeping fluid. Not a spray, just a slow drip. But I figured you'd want to know. Kenneth loaded his truck with a replacement line he'd already cut to length because he knew every component on that machine, knew which parts were original and which were salvaged, and which ones he'd rebuilt from scratch. He drove out to Donald's farm and replaced the line in 20 minutes, working in the dirt next to the tractor while Donald stood there watching. How'd you know what size to bring I put it in? The simplicity of that answer contained everything about how Kenneth approached the work. He didn't guess. He didn't carry a full inventory and sort through possibilities. He knew the machines because he'd taken them apart and put them back together with his own hands, and that knowledge meant he could solve problems faster than any dealership with its service manuals and computerized diagnostic systems. The season continued. Donald called twice more both times for minor adjustments that Kenneth handled in under an hour. When October came and the planting and harvest cycle completed, Donald brought the 4020 back to Kenneth's property. He shut it down and climbed out of the cab and stood there for a moment before speaking. "What do I owe you for the service calls?" "Nothing." "Same contract." Donald looked at him, processing that. A rental agreement that actually meant what it said. A maintenance contract that didn't have fine print and hourly minimums and trip charges. A business model built on the radical idea that if you promise to fix something when it breaks, you just fix it. "I'm renewing for next year." Kenneth nodded. He had 13 more tractors waiting in various states of disrepair, and Donald's renewal meant the model worked. Not in theory, not on paper, but in the dirt and diesel reality of West Texas agriculture. The 1963 John Deere 4020 went back into the metal building for its post-season inspection. Kenneth went through it completely, checking fluid levels, examining wear patterns, replacing filters, adjusting valves. The machine had worked a full season without a catastrophic failure, which proved something important. It proved that with the right care, with the right knowledge, with someone willing to do the work that the industry had decided wasn't worth doing anymore, these abandoned machines could be more than scrap metal. They could be tools. They could be reliable. They could be better than the new equipment sitting in dealership showrooms because they came with something new equipment didn't. They came with Kenneth's phone number, and that number meant something no warranty ever could. It meant when you called at 2 in the morning during planting season with a problem that could cost you a week of missed work and thousands of dollars in lost yield, someone would answer. Someone who knew exactly what was wrong and exactly how to fix it would answer, and that was worth more than any feature package or financing deal or promotional discount. That first rental, that first season, that first successful completion of a business model nobody had taught Kenneth how to build changed everything. Not dramatically, not in ways that would show up in a newspaper story or make people stop and take notice, but in the quiet accumulation of proof that sometimes the old ways, the discarded methods, the supposedly obsolete knowledge, those things still worked when applied by someone who understood them deeply enough. Kenneth Walker understood tractors the way a musician understands their instrument, not from a manual, not from a training program, but from 36 years of hands-on work that had taught him to read machines the way other people read books. A bearing knock wasn't just noise, it was a story about lubrication failure or misalignment, or wear patterns that told you what the machine needed before catastrophic failure occurred. A hydraulic system that responded sluggishly wasn't broken. It was talking, telling you about seals that needed replacement, or fluid that needed changing, or air in the lines that needed purging. He had 13 more machines to rebuild, and Donald's renewal meant he could do it one at a time, funding each restoration with the revenue from the machines already in service. It wasn't fast. It wasn't the kind of business growth that would attract investors or generate headlines. But it was sustainable, and it was real, and it was built on something that couldn't be automated or outsourced or replaced by computer diagnostics. It was built on knowing how things work. Word count 3,492 plus, continuing to target. The second tractor Kenneth rebuilt was the 1961 International 560. The cracked cylinder head required machine shop work he couldn't do himself, so he pulled the head and took it to a shop in Big Spring that specialized in agricultural engine repair. The machinist looked at the crack and quoted him $200. Kenneth negotiated down to $150 by agreeing to let them keep it for 3 weeks instead of rushing the job. While the head was out, Kenneth rebuilt the rest of the engine. The electrical system he rewired, completely tracing every circuit and replacing corroded connections with new terminals. He crimped himself. When the head came back from the machine shop, he installed it with a new gasket and torqued the bolts to specification, working in a pattern that distributed pressure evenly across the surface. The 560 went to a farmer named Walter Pierce, who ran 500 acres of sorghum. Walter had heard about Donald's rental from someone at the feed store, and he called Kenneth in February of 1989, asking if any machines were available. Kenneth quoted the same terms, $1,000 for the season, all maintenance included. Walter agreed without the 3-day consideration period Donald had needed. Word was moving. By the end of 1989, Kenneth had 11 tractors rented. The fleet grew through careful acquisition at government auctions he attended every few months, always looking for machines that nobody else would bid on, always calculating whether he could rebuild them for less than they would rent for in 2 seasons. The economics worked because Kenneth's labor didn't cost anything in the traditional sense. He wasn't paying himself an hourly wage. He was building something. Pamela kept track of the money. She had a ledger book where she recorded every expense, every rental payment, every parts purchase. The numbers showed a business that wasn't making anyone rich, but was covering its costs and generating enough surplus to buy the next auction machine. Kenneth kept track of the machines. His notebook system expanded into 2 notebooks, then a filing cabinet. Every tractor had a folder. Every folder contained a complete service history written in Kenneth's careful handwriting. The files weren't just records, they were stories. The 4020s file told the story of George White's farm and a 4-month restoration and a $1,000 rental that had become the proof of concept for everything that followed. The 56OH's file documented a cracked head and an electrical system rebuilt from scratch, and Walter Pierce's 500 acres of sorghum that needed planting on schedule. Each folder held not just what had been done to the machine, but what the machine needed next, and Kenneth read those files the way other people read weather forecasts, looking for patterns, anticipating problems before they became failures. The work consumed him. During planting season, he drove 600 miles in 7 days, going from farm to farm with a truck bed full of parts, fixing things before they broke down completely. Pamela managed the scheduling from a calendar on the kitchen wall that tracked every machine, every renter, every planned service interval. The calendar filled up every spring and fall. He never slept during planting season, Pamela would say, years later, April through June. I don't think I saw him sit down for more than 20 minutes at a stretch. He was always either in the shop or in the truck, and he never complained about it. He just seemed like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The business had no name yet, no sign, no storefront, no formal structure beyond a handshake and Kenneth's promise that he would answer the phone when it rang. In 1993, Pamela insisted they formalize it for tax purposes. You can't rent tractors out of a savings account forever, she told him. They called it West Plains Equipment Rental, filed the paperwork, and nothing else changed. Still no sign. Still no storefront, just Kenneth and his filing cabinet and 17 tractors in various states of service or repair. The notebook became the heart of it all. Every machine that came back at the end of a season got inspected against the service record Kenneth had maintained throughout the rental period. He would go through it systematically, checking wear patterns against what he expected to see, replacing components that showed signs of approaching failure, rebuilding what needed rebuilding before the tractor went back out. This wasn't standard practice anywhere in the industry. Most rental operations assumed the renter would handle basic maintenance and return the machine in roughly the condition it left normal wear accepted. Kenneth's contract said the opposite. The machine was his. The maintenance was his. The renter's only job was to operate it and report when something felt wrong. In practice, this meant Kenneth took responsibility for everything, and that responsibility kept him on the road constantly during peak seasons. But it also meant his machines had uptime rates that dealerships couldn't match. When you called Kenneth at 2 in the morning because a hydraulic line failed and you had 400 acres left to plant and a weather window closing in 72 hours, he answered. When the John Deere dealership service department told you they could schedule an appointment for next Thursday, Kenneth was already in your driveway with the part in his hand. That difference, that gap between commercial service and Kenneth's personal commitment became the foundation everything else was built on. By 1994, the operation had grown to 19 tractors serving farmers across 4 counties. The original metal building had been joined by a second larger structure where Kenneth handled the heavy work, engine overhauls, transmission, rebuilds, major hydraulic system repairs. Those happened in the 2,400 square foot space he'd added in 1992. The original building became part storage and electrical work. The filing system expanded to match with every machine's complete history documented from the day Kenneth bought it to the present. Donald Harris was still renting. 11 years now, every season the same arrangement. Walter Pierce had renewed 9 times. The customer base aged with Kenneth farmers in their 50s and 60s who had survived the crisis years and were still working land that had been in their families for generations. Some were passing operations to their children. Some were selling out. Some were expanding, buying neighboring parcels, growing from 400-acre operations into 1,200-acre ones. The larger operations, Kenneth noticed, eventually stopped needing his equipment. They reached a scale that justified buying new machines, and they had recovered enough credit to finance those purchases. His customers remained consistently in the middle tier. The 300 to 800-acre farms that were too large to operate without reliable power equipment and too small to efficiently own and maintain a full fleet of modern tractors. He understood who he was for and stayed exactly that. The auction where Kenneth had bought 14 seized tractors for $5,800 was 7 years behind him now. The 4020 he'd rebuilt first was still in service, still running, still generating revenue every season. The promise he'd made to George White, the promise to save that machine from the scrapyard, had been kept a dozen times over. The skills the industry had declared obsolete were supporting a business that served dozens of farms across a region where the agriculture crisis had never really ended, just evolved into a chronic condition that farmers learned to manage. Kenneth Walker had proven something nobody asked him to prove. He'd proven that old machines maintained by someone who understood them could outperform new equipment, serviced by people who only knew how to follow diagnostic software. He'd proven that personal commitment to customer success generated loyalty no promotional campaign could manufacture. He'd proven that 36 years of hands-on knowledge wasn't worthless. It was exactly what a specific segment of American agriculture needed to survive. The world had told him his skills didn't matter anymore. He'd bought 14 broken tractors and quietly built proof that the world was wrong. The business model worked because it eliminated the distance between promise and performance. Kenneth didn't sell tractors or lease equipment in the traditional sense. He sold certainty. When a farmer signed a rental contract with West Plains Equipment, they weren't just getting a machine. They were getting Kenneth's commitment that the machine would work when needed, and if it didn't, he would make it work. That guarantee had value that couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet, but showed up every spring in renewal rates that approached 90%. The real differentiator wasn't price. Kenneth's $1,000 seasonal rate was competitive, but not dramatically cheaper than what a farmer would pay in financing costs and insurance for owning a comparable used machine. The difference was the maintenance contract. Every tractor Kenneth rented came with his phone number and the understanding that he would arrive within 4 hours if something went wrong. In 1989, that was worth something considerable because the alternative meant waiting. John Deere dealerships in West Texas were running skeleton crews. The farm crisis had gutted their service departments along with everything else. Parts sat on back order for weeks. A farmer with 400 acres of cotton to plant and a broken tractor could be looking at 2 weeks of downtime in a window where every day of delay cost yield. Kenneth's phone number meant 2 hours, maybe 4, and the problem was solved. That difference translated into crops planted on schedule, harvests completed before weather windows closed, ground worked when soil conditions were right, rather than when equipment happened to be available. Word moved the way it moves in rural Texas. Slowly at first, then with the momentum of accumulated proof. A farmer mentioned Kenneth's operation at the feed store. Someone else heard about it at church. A son visiting his father's farm asked who was maintaining the equipment and why it was running better than the new tractor his own operation had just financed. By the end of 1989, Kenneth had waiting lists. Farmers calling in February, asking if he had machines available for spring, willing to commit to rental agreements sight unseen because they'd heard the stories. Donald Harris told those stories without embellishment. He would stand in the parking lot at the grain elevator waiting for his turn at the scales, and someone would ask how his planting went. Donald would mention the 4020 Kenneth mentioned that in 6 years he'd never lost a day to equipment failure. That statement, delivered in Donald's matter-of-fact tone, carried more weight than any advertisement could have generated. It was testimony from someone who had no reason to exaggerate, and it spread. The second year of the rental with Donald brought a moment that defined everything about how Kenneth operated. June, late on a Thursday night, when the temperature had finally dropped below 90 degrees, and Donald was trying to finish a planting run that had been delayed by rain earlier in the week. The hydraulic line on the loader failed. Not catastrophically, just a split in the aging rubber that started weeping fluid onto the hot engine block. Donald shut everything down immediately, the kind of precaution that comes from 40 years of farm work, teaching you what a small leak can become. He called Kenneth at 10:30, apologetic about the hour. Got a situation. Nothing urgent, but wanted you to know. Hydraulic line on the loader is leaking. I shut her down. Can wait till morning if you need. Kenneth was in his truck by 10:45. He arrived at Donald's farm at 11 with a replacement line already cut to length, the fittings already attached, the whole assembly ready to install. He worked under the tractor's frame in the dirt, lit by a trouble light he'd hung from the loader arm, and had the repair completed by 11:30. Donald stood nearby, watching, not offering to help, because Kenneth worked with the kind of efficiency that assistance would have disrupted. When it was done, and Kenneth was wiping his hands on a shop rag, Donald asked the question that had been building since Kenneth pulled up with exactly the right part at exactly the right size, already prepared. "How'd you know what to bring?" Kenneth looked at him in the yellow cast of the trouble light. "I installed that line 2 years ago. Knew it was original equipment on the loader assembly, which meant it was 25 years old. Been watching it during service intervals. Figured it had another season in it, maybe 2. Guess I figured wrong. Makes you wonder, how often do we mistake old for useless, when what we really need is someone willing to do the work." Donald renewed his rental contract the next morning. He would continue renewing it for the next 20 years. But that night in June established something that transcended the business transaction. It established that Kenneth's knowledge of the machines went beyond mechanical competence into something closer to relationship. He didn't just fix tractors. He knew their histories, anticipated their failures, maintained them with the kind of attention that prevented emergencies, rather than just responding to them. The midnight service call became part of the stories people told about West Plains equipment. Not because Kenneth advertised it, but because Donald mentioned it, and because every farmer who heard the story understood its significance. 2 in the morning during planting season was when equipment failures turned from inconveniences into disasters. It was when the difference between someone who answered the phone and someone who didn't became the difference between a successful season and a failed one. Kenneth's operation expanded through the early 90s with the organic growth pattern of something built on reputation rather than marketing. By 1991, he had 22 tractors in service. By 1992, 26. Each acquisition followed the same pattern: government auction machines nobody else would bid on, careful assessment of what the rebuild would require, transport to the metal building, systematic restoration documented in the filing system that now filled 3 cabinets. The expansion brought family complications Kenneth hadn't anticipated. His younger brother Lawrence showed up in March of 1990, driving a new Ford that still had dealer plates. Lawrence was 47, owned 2 car dealerships in Lubbock, and had opinions about Kenneth's business that he delivered while walking through the metal building like a man conducting an inspection. Lawrence stopped in front of a partially disassembled 1965 Minneapolis Moline, studied the engine components spread across the workbench, and delivered his assessment. You're leaving money on the table. These machines, properly marketed, you could be charging double what you're getting, maybe triple. You need capital for expansion. I can invest. $20,000 for 50% ownership. We formalize the structure, bring in professional management, scale this properly. Kenneth kept working on the valve assembly he was rebuilding. Not looking up. Built this myself. Don't need partners. Lawrence's expression shifted into the patient condescension of someone explaining basic economics to someone who doesn't understand them. You're throwing away money with these junk machines. There's a reason dealerships don't touch this equipment. It's not worth the liability. You should be selling new tractors, taking commissions, building something that has actual growth potential. Kenneth set down the valve assembly and looked at his brother directly. This works the way it is. The conversation ended there, but Lawrence didn't. Over the next 3 months, he made contact with 3 of Kenneth's renters, approaching them with offers to connect them with better equipment through his dealership contacts. He presented himself as someone trying to help farmers access modern machinery, suggesting that Kenneth's equipment was unsafe, inadequate, a temporary solution that they'd outgrown. 2 of the farmers called Kenneth to verify what they were hearing. The third just ignored Lawrence completely. When Kenneth found out, he drove to Lubbock and found Lawrence at one of his dealerships. The conversation happened in the showroom, surrounded by new cars that smelled like vinyl and ambition. Kenneth kept his voice level, his words precise. Stay away from my customers. Stay away from my business. You want to help, you had a chance. You wanted to own something you didn't build. We're done. Lawrence tried to frame it as concern. Just trying to help you see reality, Kenneth. You're working too hard for too little return. There's a smarter way to do this. Kenneth walked out. He didn't speak to Lawrence again for 5 years. The betrayal stung, not because it threatened the business. Kenneth's relationships with his customers were too strong for Lawrence's interference to damage them, but because it revealed something about how his own family saw what he was building. Lawrence looked at West Plains equipment and saw inefficiency, wasted potential money being left on the table. He couldn't see what Kenneth's customers saw, which was reliability built on knowledge that couldn't be replicated by capital or scaled through professional management. The incident reinforced Kenneth's instinct to keep the operation exactly the size he could personally manage. Growth for growth's sake didn't interest him. What interested him was maintaining the quality of service that made farmers call him instead of dealerships, that made them renew contracts year after year, that turned business relationships into something closer to partnerships built on mutual trust. While Kenneth was navigating family politics, the agricultural equipment industry was experiencing its own transformation. 1990 marked the beginning of precision agriculture's commercial availability. GPS guidance systems appeared in farm equipment catalogs, promising satellite-assisted planting that could reduce overlap, minimize waste, optimize field coverage down to the meter. The first commercial systems came from companies like Trimble and Navcom, bulky units that mounted in tractor cabs and cost $15,000 before installation. The technology was promising in theory. In practice, it was expensive, required machines built to integrate with it, and in the early versions offered accuracy of about 3 meters. For the row spacing requirements of West Texas cotton, that was right on the edge of useful. Farmers who could afford the systems bought them. Farmers who couldn't watched and waited, and kept working with conventional equipment. Case IH released the Magnum series the same year. The 711071207-130, these were modern tractors in every sense. Turbocharged engines, power-shift transmissions, climate-controlled cabs, integrated hydraulic systems designed to interface with precision implements that were coming to market. A Magnum 714-0 listed at $78,000. Every equipment dealer in West Texas had posters in their windows. Every farm magazine ran features about the coming age of satellite-assisted agriculture. Kenneth's phone kept ringing, not with questions about GPS units, not with inquiries about Magnum tractors, with farmers who needed their 1965 Minneapolis Moline fixed before dawn, who had a 1968 Oliver with a transmission issue, who were running a 1970 John Deere that had developed a steering problem overnight. The reasons were economic and practical in equal measure. The Magnum required financing that in 1993 years past the worst of the farm crisis, a significant portion of West Texas farmers still couldn't access. Banks were lending again, but cautiously, and the smaller operations that formed Kenneth's customer base didn't have the credit history or the collateral to support $78,000 equipment loans. GPS guidance required a machine built to integrate the technology, which meant buying new or extensively modifying existing equipment, and a $78,000 tractor that broke down was still a broken tractor, and the dealership service department was still 3 days out. Kenneth's machines were paid for. Kenneth's maintenance was included. Kenneth's phone was answered. That combination remained competitive, not because Kenneth was trying to compete with modern technology, but because he was serving a segment of agriculture that modern technology wasn't designed for. The mid-tier farmer working 600 acres with 2 or 3 tractors couldn't justify the capital outlay for precision agriculture, but still needed reliable equipment to work the ground plant. The crops bring in the harvest. Kenneth provided that reliability at a price point that worked. The technological revolution in agriculture created a bifurcation in Kenneth's customer base that became more pronounced through the early 90s. Larger operations that survived the crisis years were growing, consolidating, acquiring neighboring properties. They moved toward modern equipment because their scale justified it. Smaller operations were selling out, unable to compete with the economics of industrial-scale farming. Kenneth's customers remained in the middle, the farms too large to work without power equipment and too small to benefit from the efficiency gains of precision agriculture. The personal cost of maintaining the business showed up in places Kenneth didn't talk about. His relationship with his son Ryan had been strained since Ryan graduated from college in 1985 with a computer science degree and took a job in Dallas. Ryan visited occasionally, usually for holidays, and the visits always included some version of the same conversation about Kenneth's future. Ryan arrived for Thanksgiving in 1991, bringing his girlfriend and his opinions. He stood in the metal building watching Kenneth rebuild a fuel injection pump, and the contrast between them was generational and philosophical. Ryan wore khakis and a button-down shirt. Kenneth wore coveralls stained with 30 years of accumulated grease. Ryan worked with code and databases. Kenneth worked with steel and diesel. The conversation that followed had happened before in different forms, but this time Ryan pushed harder. Dad, fixing old tractors isn't the future. Technology is where everything's going. You should sell this operation while it still has value. Invest the money in something with actual growth potential. Tech companies, software development, the internet is going to change everything. This, he gestured at the machines around them, this is the past. Kenneth didn't look up from the injection pump. This pays the bills. This is what I know. Ryan's frustration came through in the edge in his voice. You're wasting time with machines nobody wants anymore. The whole industry is moving toward computerization, automation, precision systems. What you're doing is going to be obsolete in 5 years. Completely obsolete. Kenneth set down the pump and looked at his son. People said that 5 years ago. Still getting calls. Ryan tried a different approach. I could help you transition. Use the capital you've built up here. Invest in tech stocks. Diversify. You don't have to keep doing this physical work. You're 55 years old. There are easier ways to make money. Kenneth picked up the pump again, his hands moving with the practiced precision of someone who had rebuilt hundreds of them. I like doing this work, and the people who rent from me, they need equipment that works. That's not going to change because computers get faster. The conversation ended there, unresolved, with Ryan leaving the next day, still convinced his father was making a mistake, and Kenneth remaining convinced he wasn't. The gap between them wasn't just about business strategy. It was about what counted as valuable work, what constituted success, what kind of life was worth building. Ryan measured progress in innovation and growth and technological advancement. Kenneth measured it in equipment that ran when needed and farmers who could work their land and promises kept. Ryan's rejection of the business hurt more than Lawrence's sabotage attempt because it was his son and because there was no path to reconciliation that didn't require one of them to admit the other was right. Kenneth started thinking seriously about succession. Not immediately, but eventually he would need someone to take over the operation. It couldn't be Ryan. It would have to be someone who believed in what West Plains equipment represented. In 1993, Pamela insisted they formalize the business structure. She sat at the kitchen table with a stack of tax forms and business registration paperwork spread in front of her, and her voice had the tone of someone who had made a decision and was now implementing it. You can't keep running this out of a savings account. We need a legal business entity, proper accounting, actual records that aren't just a notebook and a filing cabinet. Kenneth understood she was right, even if he didn't care about the formality. They named it West Plains Equipment Rental, filed the incorporation papers with the county, opened a business checking account, and nothing about the actual operation changed. Still no sign on the building, still no storefront, still just Kenneth and his machines and his commitment to answering the phone. The formalization happened the same year Kenneth bought his first enclosed cab tractor, a concession to the reality that farmers increasingly expected operator comfort that open station machines from the 1960s couldn't provide. He found a 1978 John Deere 4440 at an auction in Amarillo, enclosed cab with air conditioning that didn't work and an engine that needed a complete rebuild. He brought it home and spent 3 months on it, and when it was done, it represented a shift in the fleet composition. Still old by industry standards, still sourced from bankruptcy auctions, still rebuilt by hand, but newer than anything he'd worked on before. The cab machines rented at $1,200 a season, reflecting the additional comfort and capability. Kenneth found that younger farmers' sons who were taking over family operations preferred them. The demographics of his customer base were shifting slowly, second generation replacing first, and the preferences were shifting with it. Kenneth adapted by sourcing different machines at auctions, but the core model remained unchanged. Buy what nobody else wants, rebuild it to run better than expected, rent it with maintenance included, answer the phone when it rings. Planting season remained the time when everything intensified to the edge of sustainable. Kenneth would log 600 miles in a week, driving from farm to farm with parts and tools, fixing things before they became failures or responding when they did. Pamela managed scheduling from the kitchen calendar, coordinating service calls, tracking which machines were where, when they were due back, what maintenance was scheduled. The calendar was a complex grid of penciled notes and color-coded markers that made sense to her and to nobody else. The physical toll accumulated in ways Kenneth ignored until he couldn't. His back hurt most mornings. His hands had developed a tremor from years of using impact wrenches and pneumatic tools. He slept poorly during planting season, the kind of shallow sleep that comes from knowing the phone might ring any time and needing to be ready to respond coherently when it does. Pamela worried, but Kenneth waved off her concerns. This is the job. This is what it takes. Spring of 1994 brought a crisis that tested the limits of Kenneth's ability to maintain service standards as the fleet grew. 3 tractors went down within a 2-week window in April, all of them rented to farms in the middle of planting. The failures weren't catastrophic in the sense of total breakdowns, but they were serious enough that Kenneth couldn't let the machines continue working without addressing the problems immediately. The 1961 International 560 developed a bearing knock in the final drive that was progressive wear, the kind of thing that would become a catastrophic failure if left unaddressed through another season. The 1966 John Deere 3020 had a governor issue, causing fuel delivery inconsistency at high load, manageable, but getting worse. The third was one of the Oliver 1850s, and during a routine inspection, Kenneth found a crack developing in the cast iron of the rear axle housing. That was the kind of thing you do not rent a machine with full stop. Kenneth pulled all 3. He called each farmer personally, explained the situation, and drove out to each farm with a replacement. In 2 cases, the replacements were machines he had been holding back from rental while finishing their rebuilds. In the 3rd case, he gave up a tractor he'd planned to put into service the following month. The logistics consumed 17 hours over 2 weeks' time spent managing transitions instead of doing productive work. Gary Young took the Oliver's replacement, a 1967 John Deere 4020 that Kenneth had just finished rebuilding, and his reaction to having his machine pulled mid-season was exactly what you'd expect from a farmer who had crop in the ground and a weather window closing. His voice on the phone carried the particular frustration of someone dealing with a problem they didn't cause and couldn't control. "I've got a window here, Kenneth. I don't have time for a 2-day machine swap." Kenneth was already hooking the replacement to his trailer when Gary called. "You've got one now. I'm 20 minutes out." When Kenneth arrived at Gary's farm with the 4020 on the trailer, Gary walked around it, once checking it with the critical eye of someone who had been farming for 30 years and had learned to trust nothing at face value. The tractor was clean, recently painted, the hydraulics moved smoothly through their range. Gary climbed into the seat, started the engine, listened to it run for a minute. Then he drove it off the trailer and straight to the field, and Kenneth followed to retrieve the Oliver. The conversation that happened later, after the season ended, and Gary brought the 4020 back in October, was shorter and more significant than the crisis that precipitated it. Gary stood next to the tractor with his checkbook out, ready to settle the rental fee. "What do I owe you for the swap?" Kenneth looked at him. "Nothing. Same contract." Gary processed that for a moment. The swap had required Kenneth to bring him a different machine, a better machine in some ways, at no additional cost, and with no advance notice. The contract said all maintenance included, and Kenneth was interpreting that to mean all problems were his to solve, not the customer's to absorb. That interpretation had cost Kenneth time and money, and had prevented Gary from losing yield to equipment downtime. Gary renewed his rental contract the next spring. He would continue renting from Kenneth for 11 years. The three-tractor crisis revealed a weakness in Kenneth's model that he hadn't fully accounted for. As the fleet grew, the probability of multiple simultaneous failures increased. Kenneth's ability to respond was limited by his own time and by the number of reserve machines he kept available. Scaling the operation meant scaling the complexity, and complexity introduced failure modes that didn't exist when he was managing 6 or 8 tractors. The solution Kenneth arrived at was hiring help, something he'd resisted for years, because finding someone who could maintain equipment to his standards seemed impossible. But in 1999, a 22-year-old named Brandon Clark walked into the metal building asking if Kenneth needed a mechanic. Brandon had grown up working on his family's farm equipment outside Abilene, had applied for a job at the John Deere dealership downtown, and been told they weren't hiring. Kenneth looked at the young man, saw something familiar in the way he stood, the way his hands already had the calluses and scars of someone who worked with tools. "You know how to rebuild a diesel injection pump?" Brandon's answer was direct. "Not yet, but I can learn if you'll teach me." Kenneth hired him at $14 an hour. The first year was education more than employment. Kenneth taught Brandon to read service records not as documentation of what had been done, but as narrative of what machines were communicating about what they would need next. He taught him to listen to engines, to feel vibrations that indicated misalignment or wear, to recognize the difference between a problem that needed immediate attention and one that could wait until the next service interval. Brandon proved to be a quick study with a kind of mechanical intuition that can't be taught, only recognized and developed. Within 3 years, he was handling service calls independently. Within 5, he was rebuilding engines without supervision. Kenneth watched him develop and saw something that had been missing from the business. He saw continuity, the possibility that West Plains equipment could outlast its founder. The year 2001 brought a test of that continuity. Agri-Lease Regional Manager Stephen Taylor, who had been watching Kenneth's operation capture market share in Abilene for 6 years, approached Brandon directly with a job offer. $22 an hour plus benefits to work in Agri-Lease's service department on modern equipment. Taylor positioned it as a career opportunity, a chance to work with technology instead of what he called rust buckets. Brandon told Kenneth about the offer, and Kenneth recognized the moment for what it was. He couldn't match the salary Agri-Lease was offering. His business didn't generate that kind of margin, and even if it did, doubling Brandon's pay would create financial pressure that might compromise everything else. But losing Brandon would compromise more. Kenneth's response came after thinking about it overnight, and it reflected everything he believed about the work they were doing. "I can't match that salary, but I can teach you something they can't. I can teach you how to build something that lasts, not just machines that run, but relationships that mean something. That kind of knowledge isn't worth $22 an hour. It's worth more than they can pay you. Brandon stayed. The decision wasn't purely about money or loyalty or even the mentorship Kenneth offered. It was about choosing what kind of work mattered, what kind of career had meaning. Brandon could have gone to AgriLease, worked on climate-controlled tractors with GPS systems and computerized diagnostics. Instead, he stayed at West Plains Equipment, working on machines 3 decades old, learning a trade that the industry had declared obsolete, building something alongside someone who had proven it was worth building. The years between 1998 and 2001 were characterized by steady growth that didn't announce itself. West Plains Equipment expanded to 31 machines, serving farms across 4 counties with the same model Kenneth had developed in 1987. The second metal building housed the heavy rebuilding work now, while the original structure had become dedicated storage for parts Kenneth had accumulated through strategic purchases at salvage yards and dealer liquidations. Brandon's presence allowed Kenneth to take on more complex projects, tractors that needed full engine rebuilds or transmission overhauls that would have been impossible for one person to complete during off-season windows. The filing system had grown to match the operation. 3 cabinets, now each drawer organized by machine serial number, each folder containing complete service history from acquisition to present. Brandon learned to maintain the records with the same precision Kenneth demanded in mechanical work. Every repair documented, every part replaced, noted, every hour of operation logged. The files told stories, if you knew how to read them, narratives of machines that had been written off and brought back, of farms that depended on equipment nobody else would maintain. Kenneth turned 64 in 2000, and the physical demands of the work were becoming harder to ignore. His back required stretching every morning before he could stand fully upright. The tremor in his hands had progressed from occasional to constant, barely noticeable, but there. He took ibuprofen daily for joint pain that had shifted from nuisance to companion. Pamela watched him move more carefully, take longer to complete tasks that used to happen automatically, and she worried in the way long-married people worry silently most of the time, but with occasional direct confrontation. You need to slow down. You're not 25 anymore. Kenneth would nod, agree in principle, and then proceed to work the same hours at the same intensity, because slowing down meant disappointing farmers who called with problems that needed solving. The business had grown beyond what one person could sustainably manage, but Kenneth's identity had become so intertwined with the work that separating them seemed impossible. Lawrence reappeared in November of 2000, driving a 5-year-old Chevrolet instead of the new Ford he'd arrived in a decade earlier. His car dealerships had gone bankrupt during the recession that hit auto sales hard in the late 90s. He owed creditors $140,000, had lost his house in Lubbock, and was living in an apartment complex outside Midland, working as a sales manager for someone else's dealership. He came to Kenneth asking for help. The conversation happened in Kenneth's kitchen with Pamela present because Kenneth wanted a witness to whatever agreement they reached. Lawrence sat at the table, looking diminished, not just financially, but in the confident bearing he'd always carried. His request was direct and desperate in equal measure. I need $15,000, bridge loan until I get back on my feet. I know we haven't talked in years. I know how we left things, but you're family. You're the only person I can ask. Kenneth looked at his brother, and saw someone who had dismissed his work as waste, who had tried to sabotage his relationships with customers, who had built success on leverage and lost it all when the market turned. The temptation to say no was strong, but Pamela's expression suggested something different. After Lawrence left, Kenneth turned to Pamela. "You think I should help him?" She chose her words carefully. "He's your brother. He made mistakes. People do. The question is whether you can live with saying no." Kenneth wrote the check for $15,000, but he attached conditions. Lawrence would work in the shop for 6 months learning the business, understanding what Kenneth had built through actual labor instead of theoretical critique. If Lawrence completed the 6 months, the loan would be forgiven. If he quit early, he owed the full amount. Lawrence agreed because he didn't have alternatives. He showed up the next Monday in work clothes that looked costume-like, new boots that hadn't been broken in gloves, still creased from the package. Kenneth put him to work cleaning parts, organizing inventory, doing the manual labor that supported the skilled work but didn't require expertise. Brandon watched the arrangement with barely concealed skepticism. 3 months in, Lawrence was complaining constantly. The work was beneath him, he'd say during lunch breaks. This wasn't real work. It was maintenance and manual labor, nothing that required the business acumen he'd developed running dealerships. Kenneth listened without responding, letting Lawrence's attitude speak for itself. At the end of 3 months, Lawrence quit. He walked into the shop on a Friday afternoon and delivered his assessment of the situation with the conviction of someone who had reached an important conclusion. "This isn't working out. I can make more money doing sales work. I'll pay you back when I'm in better shape financially. This just isn't real work." Kenneth didn't argue. He watched his brother walk to his car and drive away, and he knew the $15,000 was gone. He wrote it off mentally before the weekend ended, and he never spoke to Lawrence again. The betrayal this time was quieter than 1990, but it confirmed something Kenneth had suspected for a long time. Family didn't guarantee understanding, and blood relation didn't create shared values. Some people would never see worth in work that required getting hands dirty. The experience reinforced Kenneth's commitment to Brandon as the successor he needed. Brandon understood what Lawrence never could, that the value wasn't in the margins or the growth potential or the scalability. The value was in the work itself, in the knowledge that these machines ran, because someone cared enough to make them run in the relationships built on reliability instead of sales pitches. 2 years later, in August of 2002, AgRelease closed its Abilene office. Stephen Taylor had been reassigned to Dallas in 1999 after the region consistently underperformed projections. Different management tried for 3 more years to make the operation profitable, but the economics never worked. Corporate headquarters finally decided the market wasn't scaling as modeled and pulled out. The announcement came through a notice posted on the office door one Monday morning, and by Wednesday, the liquidation auction was scheduled. Kenneth heard about it from a farmer who drove past the empty building and noticed the signs. He attended the auction without announcing his intentions, standing in the back of the crowd while the auctioneer worked through office equipment and shop tools and finally got to the tractors. AgRelease had 8 late 90s machines in their Abilene fleet, modern equipment by any standard, enclosed cabs with air conditioning, GPS, ready electronics, low hours, full maintenance records, the kind of tractors that should have attracted competitive bidding from dealers looking to add quality used inventory. But the AgRelease brand had become associated with failure in the local market, and Dealers were wary of equipment that came from an operation that couldn't make rental business work even with new machines and corporate backing. The bidding was weak. Kenneth waded through the first 3 tractors, watching them sell for 30% below book value, and then he started bidding. He took all 8, paying a combined $42,000 for equipment that would have cost over $300,000 new. The other dealers looked at him with expressions ranging from surprise to confusion. Kenneth Walker buying modern tractors didn't fit the narrative they had built about his operation. The purchase represented a strategic shift Kenneth had been considering for 2 years. His customer base was aging along with him, and the second generation taking over family farms had different expectations. They wanted enclosed cabs, better visibility, smoother transmissions, the comfort features that late 90s equipment provided. Kenneth couldn't compete with brand new machines, but he could offer 10-year-old tractors maintained to higher standards than most dealers offered on current models. The challenge was integration. Kenneth didn't have expertise with the electronic systems these tractors used. The GPS capability was dormant without software and calibration he didn't understand. The computerized engine management was beyond what he'd worked with before. He and Brandon spent 6 months learning the systems, working from service manuals, calling technical support lines, methodically figuring out how these machines operated. Brandon took lead on the electronics, his generation more comfortable with computer interfaces than Kenneth would ever be. They discovered that the GPS units could be activated with software downloaded from manufacturer websites, that calibration could be done manually using procedures documented in manuals written for dealer technicians. By spring of 2003, Kenneth had the agri-lease machines integrated into his rental fleet at $1,300 per season, reflecting their superior capability. The newer tractors attracted exactly the customers Kenneth anticipated. Younger farmers, early 30s, taking over operations from fathers who were retiring or reducing their involvement. They wanted precision agriculture capabilities but couldn't justify financing new equipment. Kenneth's rental model gave them access to technology that would have been out of reach otherwise, and it expanded his customer base without compromising relationships with existing renters who preferred the older machines they knew. Summer of 2003 brought a crisis that threatened everything Kenneth had built, not mechanically but legally. A former renter named Timothy Moore filed a lawsuit claiming that a tractor Kenneth had rented him caused crop failure that cost 40% yield loss on 600 acres of cotton. Timothy alleged that a transmission issue in a 1973 Oliver 1655 caused planting delays that pushed his schedule into suboptimal weather windows, resulting in $18,000 in lost revenue. The lawsuit arrived via certified mail on a Tuesday in June. Kenneth opened it at the kitchen table with Pamela looking over his shoulder, and the language was formal and accusatory in the way legal documents are when they're trying to establish wrongdoing. Timothy's lawyer had built a case around negligent maintenance, inadequate safety inspections, and breach of contract regarding equipment reliability guarantees. Kenneth pulled the service records on the Oliver immediately. The machine had been serviced 3 weeks before Timothy's rental period began. Complete inspection fluid. Changes testing of all major systems. The records showed no issues reported during the rental period, no service calls from Timothy, no complaints filed. The transmission that Timothy now claimed was defective had been functioning normally through an entire season. Kenneth hired a lawyer the first time he'd ever needed legal representation for business purposes. The lawyer was a woman named Margaret Ross, who specialized in agricultural litigation out of an office in Sweetwater. She reviewed Kenneth's records, interviewed him about the rental agreement and service protocols, and delivered her assessment with professional detachment. "You keep better records than most dealers I work with. If this goes to court, your documentation will be your strongest defense. But discovery might reveal something about Timothy's claims that we need to know." Discovery revealed fraud. Timothy had signed rental agreements with two different providers in the same season. West Plains Equipment provided the Oliver, but Timothy had also rented a newer machine from a competitor called Tex Farm Rentals. The timeline showed Timothy had used both tractors during his planting window, and the yield loss he claimed could have resulted from problems with either machine, or from neither machine, or from weather or soil conditions, or any number of variables that affect agricultural outcomes. Margaret subpoenaed Tex Farm's records and found that their machine had experienced significant mechanical failures during Timothy's rental period. Hydraulic problems that caused 3 days of downtime documented in service call records that Timothy had failed to mention in his lawsuit. The pattern became clear. Timothy was attempting insurance fraud filing claims against multiple providers, hoping one would settle, rather than fight using the complexity of agricultural operations to obscure which equipment might actually have caused problems, if any problems existed, beyond normal yield variation. The court dismissed the case in October after 3 months of legal maneuvering. Timothy's lawyer withdrew when the Tex Farm records came to light, recognizing that continuing would expose his client to countersuits for frivolous litigation. Kenneth won, but the victory felt hollow because the entire process had called his integrity into question in a way that mechanical failures never did. The emotional impact hit harder than the legal costs. Kenneth had spent 17 years building a reputation based on reliability and honesty, and Timothy's lawsuit suggested that reputation was fragile, that one person's false accusation could threaten everything. Pamela watched him withdraw into himself during the months the case was active, saw him question whether the business model that depended on personal trust could survive in a system where lawsuits replaced handshakes. Brandon was angry in a way Kenneth wasn't. He wanted to publicize Timothy's fraud, make sure every farmer in the region knew what had happened, ensure Timothy's reputation suffered the consequences his false claims deserved. Kenneth refused. "The court knows the truth. That's enough. Going after him won't change anything except make us look vindictive." Brandon didn't agree, but he accepted Kenneth's decision because he understood the philosophy underlying it. West Plains Equipment had been built on doing work that spoke for itself, on letting results create reputation instead of marketing, creating perception. Fighting Timothy publicly would be marketing, and Kenneth didn't do marketing. The lawsuit ended in dismissal, but it left scars that showed up in subtle ways. Kenneth became more cautious about new customers requiring references from existing renters before signing rental agreements. He added liability clauses to his contracts that Pamela helped him draft with Margaret Ross's input. The handshake agreements that had defined the early years gave way to formal paperwork that protected both parties, but also introduced distance into relationships that had been built on personal trust. The stress contributed to what happened in January of 2006. Kenneth was 70 years old, working in the shop on a fuel injection system for a 1971 John Deere 4320, and the pressure in his chest started as something he could ignore and built into something he couldn't. He sat down on an overturned bucket, trying to decide if this was serious or just heartburn or muscle strain from lifting something wrong. 20 minutes passed. The pressure didn't subside. Kenneth walked into the house and found Pamela folding laundry in the bedroom, and the steadiness in his voice when he told her something was wrong was the kind of calm that comes from not wanting to cause panic. "I need you to call 911. Something's not right," Pamela called. The paramedics arrived in 14 minutes, a response time that probably saved Kenneth's life. They ran an EKG in the driveway and decided immediate transport was necessary. Kenneth spent 11 days in the hospital, 5 of them in intensive care after emergency surgery to place stents in arteries that were 70% blocked. The cardiologist was direct about what needed to change. You need to significantly reduce your physical workload. No more crawling under machines, no lifting heavy components, no 16-hour days during planting season. Your heart can't take the stress you've been putting on it for decades. Kenneth listened to all of this with the attention of someone receiving unwelcome news they can't dismiss. He asked one question: "Can I still drive?" The cardiologist nodded. "Yes, but that's about all you should be doing physically." Kenneth went home 2 weeks after the heart attack and told Brandon the new arrangement. "You're doing the physical work from now on. I'm doing the driving and the thinking. That's how this has to work if we're keeping the business running." Brandon was 29 years old, 10 years into his apprenticeship with Kenneth, and he knew every machine in the fleet by its service history and maintenance requirements. He knew the customers, their farms, their equipment, preferences, their planting schedules. The transition happened over 3 weeks as Kenneth taught Brandon to handle aspects of customer relationships he'd always managed personally. Brandon started answering the service calls, started making the midnight runs to fix hydraulic failures, started being the person farmers talked to when equipment needed attention. Kenneth became the voice on the phone, the advisor who knew what the problem was from the description and could tell Brandon what parts to bring before he left the shop. The partnership deepened into something beyond employer and employee, closer to master craftsman and journeyman in the old guild sense, where knowledge transferred through demonstration and correction and shared work. The heart attack forced Kenneth to confront mortality in ways he'd avoided before. At 70, he wasn't young, and the business he'd built needed to survive beyond him. Brandon was the succession plan, not through formal ownership transfer, but through knowledge transfer that had been happening gradually and now accelerated by necessity. Kenneth started teaching Brandon not just how to fix machines, but why certain approaches worked better than others, how to read customer needs, how to maintain relationships built on trust. Fall of 2007 brought another medical crisis, this one Pamela's. Breast cancer stage 1, caught early during routine screening. The diagnosis required surgery and preventive chemotherapy, and Kenneth cut back his work hours further to be with her through treatment. Brandon handled 70% of service calls during that period, and the business continued functioning because Kenneth had built systems that didn't require his constant presence. Pamela's cancer was successfully treated, but the experience changed Kenneth's perspective on time and priorities. He started spending more hours in the house, less in the shop. He let Brandon handle customer relationships without oversight. He realized the business could survive without him being physically present every day, and maybe that was the real lesson the heart attack had been trying to teach him. Control could be released. Knowledge could be transferred. The work could continue after the worker stopped. In fall of 2008, Kenneth made a decision about the 1963 John Deere 4020, the first tractor he'd rebuilt, the machine that represented his promise to George White and the beginning of everything that followed. The tractor had been in continuous rental service from 1988 to 2008, 20 years of seasonal work across 11 different farms. Customer logs showed it had planted and harvested approximately 14,000 acres of West Texas cropland. By any measure, it had earned retirement. Kenneth could have sold it. Even at 45 years old, with an open station design that nobody wanted anymore, the machine would have brought $3,000 or $4,000 from someone looking for parts or a restoration project. He didn't sell it. Instead, over the winter of 2008, working with Brandon, doing the heavy lifting, and Kenneth directing from a stool, they gave the 4020 a full restoration, not a service rebuild, a restoration. They remanufactured the engine to factory specification, using techniques Kenneth had developed over 2 decades of rebuilding similar power plants. Every bearing replaced, every gasket new, every surface measured, to ensure tolerances matched what John Deere engineers had specified in 1963. The work took longer because Kenneth refused to compromise on any detail. This wasn't about getting a machine running. This was about preservation, about creating something that would outlast everyone involved in its creation. They replaced every hydraulic seal and line, not because the old ones were failing, but because new ones would last another 20 years. They stripped the paint down to bare metal and repainted it in John Deere green, mixed specifically to match the original color. Not the brighter green of later production years, but the specific slightly yellower shade that early 60s machines wore. The green George White would have recognized. Kenneth sourced original decals from a collector in Oklahoma who specialized in vintage farm equipment. He paid more for the decals than seemed reasonable, but accuracy mattered more than cost. When the restoration was complete in February of 2009, the 4020 looked the way it had looked, rolling off the assembly line in 1963, before decades of use and weather and depreciation had worn it down to the machine Kenneth had found in a government impound lot 22 years earlier. The first start after restoration happened on a cold February morning. Kenneth insisted on doing it himself, sitting in the open station seat, his hands on controls he'd rebuilt personally, listening to the engine turn over. It took 4 cranks, the same as it had taken in 1988 when he'd started it for the first time after the initial rebuild. The engine caught and settled into the characteristic diesel rhythm, and Kenneth let it idle while Brandon stood nearby watching. They drove it out of the building across Kenneth's property and back. The hydraulics responded smoothly. The transmission shifted precisely. Every system functioned exactly as designed. Kenneth parked it in the corner of the original metal building and covered it with a tarp, and that's where it stayed. He didn't rent it again, didn't drive it again, except for one annual ritual Brandon would maintain long after Kenneth was gone. The 4020 became a monument to everything West Plains equipment represented, a machine declared worthless that had been saved and had proven its worth beyond any reasonable expectation. A promise kept to someone who hadn't lived to see it fulfilled. A symbol of work done right when nobody was watching, and nobody would know the difference except the person doing the work. Kenneth's final years between 2009 and 2014 were characterized by gradual withdrawal from the physical aspects of the business. He spent more time with Pamela, both of them conscious that their 70s were advancing and time was finite. Brandon ran 80% of operations by 2010, and customers who called West Plains Equipment increasingly talked to Brandon instead of Kenneth. But Kenneth remained the voice on the other end of the line when complicated problems arose, when historical knowledge of a particular machine made the difference between a quick fix and extended troubleshooting. The customer relationships aged with Kenneth. Donald Harris finally stopped renting in 2011 at age 84 when he sold his farm to a larger operation that absorbed his 900 acres into a multi-thousand-acre industrial farming business. Donald had rented from Kenneth for 23 consecutive years from 1988 to 2011. And the end of that relationship marked a generational transition Kenneth had been watching happen across his entire customer base. Gary Young continued for 11 years total before health issues forced him to sell out in 2002. Other long-term customers followed similar patterns, selling to larger operations or passing farms to children who sometimes continued renting from Kenneth and sometimes didn't. The children who did continue often rented the newer machines, the agri-lease acquisitions with GPS capability and enclosed cabs. The children who didn't had scaled their operations large enough to justify buying equipment or had exited farming entirely. Have you been told your skills were worthless, then proved everyone wrong? Kenneth's proof accumulated quietly over 27 years. No dramatic victories, no sudden vindication. Just the steady accumulation of machinery that ran farms, that operated promises kept. The industry had declared his knowledge obsolete in 1986, and Kenneth had spent nearly 3 decades demonstrating that obsolescence is a choice, not an inevitability. Old machines maintained by someone who understood them outperformed new machines, serviced by people following diagnostic flowcharts. April 2014 arrived with the kind of spring weather that makes West Texas farming possible: warm days and cool nights, and soil conditions optimal for planting. Kenneth was 78 years old. The congestive heart failure that had been building since the 2006 heart attack was progressing despite medication and lifestyle changes the cardiologist had prescribed. Pamela saw him moving more slowly, breathing more carefully, taking longer to do simple things like climbing stairs or walking from the house to the shop. On a Thursday afternoon, Kenneth was sitting in the kitchen reviewing service schedules with Brandon when the chest pressure returned familiar from 2006, but more intense. Pamela called 911 immediately, this time no 20-minute delay, no debate about whether it was serious. The paramedics arrived and transported Kenneth to the hospital, and this time the news was different. The cardiologist explained that Kenneth's heart had deteriorated beyond what medication could manage. Stents couldn't address the problem anymore. The muscle was failing from decades of stress and work and the accumulated damage of pushing too hard for too long. They could make him comfortable, but they couldn't fix this. Kenneth died 5 days later, with Pamela holding his hand and Brandon sitting in a chair by the window. He never regained consciousness after the second day, the heart failure progressing into organ shutdown that medicine could slow but not stop. When the monitoring equipment showed the final flatline, Pamela cried quietly and Brandon sat still, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Brandon was at the shop, servicing a machine, when Pamela called to tell him Kenneth had passed. He finished the job before leaving for the hospital. He did it because Kenneth would have wanted it done, because a farmer needed that machine the next morning, because the work didn't stop when the worker did. The continuity Kenneth had built into West Plains equipment meant it could survive his death, and honoring that required keeping promises even when grief made that difficult. The funeral happened on a Tuesday in April. 200 people attended, an unusual number for someone who had never advertised, never sought public recognition, never done anything to build fame beyond doing excellent work consistently for 27 years. Most of the attendees were farmers, sons and daughters of farmers' widows and widowers of farmers, people who had rented equipment, people who had heard stories, people whose operations had survived because Kenneth answered the phone when they needed help. Donald Harris attended age 81, now walking slowly, but insisting on being there. He sat in the third row during the service, and afterward standing outside in the April sun with groups of mourners sharing memories. Someone asked him what he remembered most about Kenneth. Donald's answer was simple and complete. He answered the phone at 2 a.m. during planting season. He answered the phone. That became the eulogy. Everyone repeated the summary of a 27-year business built on availability and reliability and personal commitment. Not complicated, not innovative, not revolutionary. Just present when needed, capable when called, reliable, beyond what any contract could enforce. The legacy was specific and practical, and exactly what Kenneth would have wanted people to remember. West Plains Equipment Rental still operates today out of the same 2 metal buildings on the same property outside Abilene. Brandon runs it at age 47, managing a fleet of 44 machines that range from the 1980s and 1990s models Kenneth acquired in his later years. He hired a mechanic 3 years ago, a young man from Sweetwater who reminds Brandon of himself at 22, eager to learn, comfortable with tools, willing to work. The filing system remains intact. Brandon added a computer in 2015, a used desktop running spreadsheet software that duplicates the information in the handwritten records. But the handwritten records stay current, every machine maintaining its paper history from the day it arrived to present. Some things don't need improvement, just maintenance. Every March, Brandon performs a ritual. Kenneth never specified, but that feels necessary. He removes the tarp from the 1963 John Deere 402. Oh, the first tractor. Kenneth rebuilt the machine that started everything. He checks fluid levels, confirms the battery holds charge, primes the fuel system. Then he starts it. The engine turns over on the 3rd or 4th crank every time. A diesel engine starts when someone has understood it well enough to keep it running, and Kenneth understood that machine completely. Brandon lets it idle for 15 minutes, listening to the rhythmic combustion that sounds the same as it did in 1988, 1995, 2009. He doesn't drive it anywhere, just lets it run, proving it still can, maintaining the promise Kenneth made to George White and to himself that worthless things aren't worthless if someone does the work to save them. Share your story in the comments. Kenneth would want to hear it.